The person who actually started CWHC, as we called it at the time, was a woman named Jean Hunt. And Jean Hunt was teaching history at Loop College. She got the idea to start an organization in Chicago when she was coming back from a professional American history organization meeting with two other Chicago women historians. And they were traveling back and they were lamenting what they had just experienced at this professional organization. And that was that there was no interest in women's history among the leaders of the organization, who at that time were all men, mostly white men, scholars. There was no interest in it, and there was little opportunity for women historians to advance in the profession. So as a result of their discussion on this trip, they decided, I think we should start an organization in Chicago that starts addressing some of these issues. So they finally said, let's call it the Chicago Area Women's History Conference in the fall of '71. The board always met at the Newberry Library. They were very gracious about providing a space. We had our meetings in the Fellows Lounge, which was a very august space on the second floor of the Newberry Library, and it had photographs on the walls of all of these distinguished male historians. These meetings were set up so that women historians could read their papers, talk about research work that they were working on, often in isolation. You know, that was one of the problems, was that the people who were interested in women's history were very isolated from each other, but they were part of a group and they came together and they discussed their research and then got feedback on their papers from people. Gerda Lerner, this great pioneer in women's history, came and spoke to our organization. And she also believed very strongly in establishing the field of women's history. She said, I'm asked, what is women's history? And she said, I say, women's history is the story of what women were doing when men were doing what they thought was so important. This was a very heady time. The explosion of women's activism was beginning, and women were very interested at that time in their own history because they felt, as they said, that their history had been stolen from them because it had not been recorded and honored in, some of the main institutions. We did begin doing some public history programs, planning events and different things that were open to the public as well. That eventually led into publication of a book that we published called Walking with Women Through Chicago History, 4 self-guided tours. We became more and more aware of the fact that there really wasn't a good book on Chicago women's history. Rima Schultz and Adele Hast stepped forward to be the co-directors of the project. Originally, the thought was to write a narrative history, that we would be, telling the story of women's history in Chicago. We ended up writing this very important book, Women Building Chicago, and along with 350 writers throughout the city, we wrote the biographies of 423 women from Chicago history, and it's become a major source. The time frame for Women Building Chicago for inclusion in the book was 1790 to 1990. A woman had to have died by 1990 to be in Women Building Chicago. In 2001, we changed it to the Chicago Women's History Center, and that reflected the fact that we actually had a place. And my idea was to create a place where the organization would have a home and where people could come and that we could have meetings about women's history and the board could meet here and we could start developing a real collection. So we started a project which originally was called Documenting the Women's Movement in Chicago, and the focus was on doing oral histories and identifying archival material that related to women that were involved with the second wave women's movement.
Yeah, I worked there for 24 years, 24 of the 31 years at the coffee house, from 74 to 2005. There was plays, it was a lot of music, a lot of performers that would perform at Michigan, would come to the coffee house, or women linguists and writers like Sarah Hoagland, Julia Penelope, Mary Daly, like the cream of the crop. In '81, we had more like Ginny Clemens and I'm trying to think who else. Artemis, who was still going, our women's lesbian chorus. Our three things were women only, suggested donation, more if you can, less if you can't, and alcohol and drug free. So those were the three things.
Those of us who were organizers, women organizers, it was like a whole new world. It was half the population. We could do the strategy, we could do the position papers, we could make the speeches, we could run the meetings. We had a speakers bureau, you probably know about, in CWHC, where we trained each other to be speakers, and people went on television. That was all stuff that just men did before. It was huge.
I think that that we have to recognize that we are in still a politically hostile climate where women and girls and LGBT plus communities and immigrants are the most vulnerable, and that the opposition is still very much emboldened by the previous administration, because anti-choice legislators are using religion as a weapon of oppression, particularly in Southern and rural communities, to usurp individual human rights, especially around areas of reproductive and sexual health.
There was a wonderfulness about the kinds of books that I was not used to seeing, that I knew were out there. So for me, as a Latina, as a lesbian, as a young adult, it was such a powerful experience, very powerful. So
touching you very personally.
it is very, I think for a lot of us, it was very personal, because we found a place where we could be who we were. And that was still newer back in the 80s. So I think we take so much for granted now, and it's wonderful because there's been such movement, such growth. I think especially those of us outside of major metropolitan areas, it was just like we had found heaven.
I'm a filmmaker, and I had a screening at Women and Children First in 1993, and by this time, of course, they'd moved to the Andersonville location. And again, had a great turnout, and everyone was super friendly, and I met someone there who continues to be a friend today. In fact, we often talk about meeting at Women and Children First, and she's moved all over the country, it feels like all over the world in some cases, but we often think about how much fun and what Women and Children First meant in terms of being a place where you connected with other people, other women who shared similar ideas and views, and women who were genuinely interested in what was happening with women and girls in Chicago.
I think the importance of what we're doing at this point is that we are bringing together a lot of threads, so that we're seeing the activities of one woman or the importance of one organization in a larger context. And so we are able to evaluate it. What worked, what didn't work, where are we now? Things are being rolled back. There's a backlash. There have been backlashes before, but people kept working, So the fact that we have all these pieces and we're putting them together into a big picture allows us to have a larger view on what was going on. So I think that's the importance. And then I think it's also just important to have a place. I think people enjoy very much being together and sharing their enthusiasm for women's history.